Today, we will be discussing the rise of communism in China in the 20th century. Now, this will be the first part of a new two-part series, with this first part mainly focusing on how communism rose to power in China in the first place, and how Mao Zedong rose to become the leader of the Chinese Communist Party and the wider communist movement in China. While the second part will focus on what Mao did once he was in power and what the wider effects of that were. So ultimately, this series seeks to explain how and why communism came to power in China and what the effects of that were. But first, some background. So China, by the time of the 20th century, China was being ruled by the Qing dynasty, which had ruled it for the past few centuries, the latest in the string of dynasties that had ruled China for millennia by this point. However, they weren't in such a good spot by this point either. As you see, they had just experienced what today is referred to as the Century of Humiliation. This began with the Opium Wars of the 1840s, which saw China go to war with, more accurately, Britain go to war with China, because Britain wanted to make a whole bunch of money by selling opium to China. China didn't want to allow them to sell opium, so Britain invaded, and Britain, with its much stronger, more modern military, it was able to effectively crush Chinese forces, and this began a string of wars, rebellions, and so-called unequal treaties, which saw China give up land, give trade concessions, territorial concessions, diplomatic concessions, which greatly weakened the power of the state, and also largely humiliated the leadership within the Qing dynasty. This led to a number of rebellions, most famously the Taiping and Boxer rebellions. The Taiping Rebellion back in the 1850s occurred because a Chinese man, Hongji Swan, had fever dreams after failing an exam, which led him to believe that he was the brother of Jesus Christ, and then he launched a rebellion against the central government, and it ended up being one of the deadliest wars in all of human history. Meanwhile, the Boxer Rebellion of 1899 to 1901, and that was led by the Boxer movement, which sought to reaffirm Chinese sovereignty from against the European powers, and was also crushed. And the Century of Humiliation sort of culminates with the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895, which saw China and Japan come to blows over Korea, as both sides wanted to include Korea in their own sphere of influence, so they went to war over the territory, as they had done before in history, except this time round, Japan had spent the last 30 years, ever since the Meiji Restoration, they had spent the last 30 years modernizing and militarizing, compared to China, who had spent that time effectively getting shafted by the European powers, which meant that the Japanese were able to soundly defeat the Chinese and establish Japanese control over Korea, as well as the island of Taiwan. So all of these were greatly embarrassing for the Qing dynasty, to say the least. And this culminated with the Xinhai Revolution of 1912, which was led by this man, Dr. Sun Yat-sen. Now, this revolution, it had a number of goals, with the main one being to overthrow the Qing dynasty and establish a new Chinese republic, which it did, but it didn't particularly go smoothly, sure, they were successful in overthrowing the monarchy without immediately descending into a civil war, or the fracturing of the authority of the central government caused China to enter a period of warlordism for the next decade or so, which fractured the nation, and it's today referred to as the warlord era. And then after an attempt by a Mr. Yuan Shikai to restore the monarchy with himself as Emperor of China, uh, the Chinese Republic was officially established with Sun Yat-sen leading it. Where he then went on to form the Kuomintang Party, to act as the leading party for the Chinese Republic. And around this same time, we also see the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. And the two sides formed a united front in 1924 in order to try and deal with the warlordism issue. And Sun Yat-sen, he is still widely remembered in both China and Taiwan today as being sort of the father of modern China. And he and the Kuomintang movement and was guided by his so-called three principles of the people, or socialism, democracy, and nationalism. So socialism to effectively reinvent and modernise China's economy and gain itself economic independence from the European powers. Democracy, which pretty self-explanatory, it's democracy. And nationalism to build a more centralised, homogenised Chinese state. Although the democracy bit of that couldn't be implemented right away, considering the weakness of the central government, so they entered into a period known as the People's Tutelage, where the Kuomintang would rule with effectively absolute authority and prepare, near quotes, the nation for democracy. So that was set up by Sun Yat-sen, and he continued with that till his death in 1925. After Sun's death, the Kuomintang was taken over by Chiang Kai-shek, and he wasn't particularly fond of the communists. And a year after gaining power, in 1926, he orchestrated the Shanghai Massacre, which saw thousands of Chinese communists murdered at the hands of Kuomintang forces. This began the first phase of the Chinese Civil War, which saw the communists flee into southern China and begin to fight the government in brutal guerrilla warfare, eventually establishing the Chinese Soviet Republic. However, things weren't going well for them, as by 1934 the nationalists had them encircled and were pushing inwards, which meant that, unless the communists took decisive action, they were going to lose. And so that decisive action that they decided to take has since become known as the Long March. This saw communist forces break out of the encirclement and march north into the mountains of northern China in order to re-establish themselves up there and reconsolidate their forces for a potential continuation of the Civil War. It's also during this time when we see Mao Zedong, this man, take power of the communist movement. And so, in short, Chiang Kai-shek takes power, Civil War breaks out, Mao takes power of the communist movement. But then we have something that comes in and shakes up the whole situation in China. That being Japan. They're back and more aggressive than ever. As in 1931, they orchestrate the Mukden incident in the northern Chinese region of Manchuria, which sees the Japanese army, acting largely without orders from the central government, invade and establish their own control over the Manchuria region, and actually install the deposed Chinese Emperor Puyi as its sort of puppet head of state. And Japan continues to try and chip away at China and eventually decides to go further in. All the while Chiang Kai-shek is more so focused on trying to wipe out the communists. And this culminates in the Jing'an incident, where Chiang Kai-shek is effectively kidnapped and forced to create a second Chinese United Front with the communists against Japan. And this comes just in time for the Marco Polo Bridge incident of 1937. the Marco Polo Bridge being a bridge in Beijing, which at the time sat on the border between the Republic of China and Manchuria. And the Marco Polo Bridge incident saw Chinese and Japanese troops exchange fire, which the Japanese used as a pretext for an all-out invasion of China. This invasion, it's mostly remembered for how infamously brutal it was. Japan was constantly committing some of the most heinous war crimes in all of history, with perhaps the most prominent example being the rape of Nanking, which saw them effectively sack the Chinese capital of Nanking and murder whoever they lay their sights on. It was truly, truly horrific. But the war also saw the nationalists act in some ways which could be considered incompetent. And constant military failures, as they burst the dikes and dams along the Yellow River in order to deliberately flood it in order to slow down the Japanese forces, which sure it did, but it also killed hundreds of thousands of Chinese people. Well, and here's where we sort of see how the war goes, where the nationalists sort of take the lead and do most of the fighting, whereas Mao and his communists up in the mountains, they engage in a bit of fighting, but they mostly stay up in the mountains, consolidating their forces, building their power base, building their support, and biding their time. And that time would come in 1945, with the surrender of Japan, as since the great foreign foe was now vanquished, it was now time to immediately go back to killing each other. And Mao was greatly bolstered by the fact that the Soviets, having launched an invasion of Japanese-controlled Manchuria in the closing days of the war, then decided to give Manchuria to Mao and the Chinese communists. And this, combined with a number of tactical failures by the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek and the communists performing their own encirclements on nationalist forces, this saw the nationalists get soundly defeated, with them eventually being forced to flee to Taiwan, where they remain to this day, and actually still officially refer to themselves as the Republic of China, and still see themselves as the exact same republic that was established under Sun Yat-sen. But, in any case, the Chinese communists were now in full, total control over the Chinese mainland. And with this, in 1949, they proclaimed the creation of the People's Republic of China, which still exists to this day, and is the current government on the mainland China. So this was established as a new one-party communist state with Mao at its centre. And the effects of this were immense. This greatly shifted the sort of balance of power in the East Asian region, and greatly bolstered the sort of wider communist bloc, gave credence to the domino theory, which postulates that, if one country falls to communism, the others around it will follow, because, so first Russia fell to communism, then Mongolia, now China, North Korea. What's next? All of Korea? Japan? Vietnam? They would have, some of those neighbouring countries would eventually end up falling to communism, of course. And China would have a major hand in these communist movements, particularly with the Korean War, where they would end up directly intervening on the side of North Korea, which saw them push the UN forces right back to approximately where the pre-war border was on the Korean Peninsula. So in short, the Qing dynasty collapsed. A unstable Chinese republic took over. The founder and visionary of the republic, Sun Yat-sen, passed away, and his successors took a more hardline approach against communists, which resulted in civil war, or Mao took power of the communist movement, and Japan invaded, so they were forced to work together. But whilst the nationalists got weakened and ground down and humiliated themselves, the communists bided their time, and after the war were able to use the support and the resources they had built up during that time to finally defeat the nationalists and take all of China over for themselves. So, thank you very much for watching. Keep an eye out for part 2, which should be coming at some stage. Like, comment and subscribe if you like the video. If you have any further questions or any topics that you'd like me to cover, please leave them in the comments down below. And I'll be seeing all of you in the next video. Goodbye.